Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Garcia-Perez. I'm from San Cloud State University. I'm a professor of economics there. I joined right at the beginning of the pandemic this project. I've been hearing about the NACS scorecards for a long time and discussing some of the things. And then right before the pandemic, like life is like that, divided in that way. I joined this research, focusing on what it's going to be called the phase 2 of Baltimore study, and it's great tracking after, or my presentation being after the previous presentation, because then they give a lot of the pre-information of what the second phase is going to be. The goal of this study is to analyze the association between credit scores and the measures related to income, wealth inequality across incarceration history in race households. So the idea is, in the perfect world, would be to be having information at the individual level and have information about incarceration history at the individual level and wealth history at the individual level. But some of these measures first are measured at the household level, so at the family or household level, and some others are also very stigmatized and harder to get information directly from the individuals. But the idea is to separate individuals between the race categories and incarceration exposure or history, which really the exposure or history here would be whether a member of the household or the family has been incarcerated, and that meaning identifying that member has to have some relationship in how income and expenses are developed in the household. Just to give results preview, because there's going to be a lot of numbers and tables, the service reporter status and lack of trust affect response rate. So this is a phase 2 of phase 1 that was presented by Rafi and Jorge, and Aaron and Roland. And the sample size for the city of Baltimore was 254 individuals. So now we're coming back to those individuals and ask them a little bit more sensitive question if wealth is not already sensitive, which is about the FICO scores. And then already they were asked about incarceration history in the family. There is evidence of a relationship between credit scores and race and incarceration history, in the way that having incarceration history can translate or relates to a lower FICO score, around 250 points below the comparison group, which is, it's going to be white without incarceration household history. The tangible asset among people with incarceration history is remarkably high to be car ownership, and the credit score among incarcerated white more than 100 points above the corresponding values for incarcerated blacks. And another point that is going to be in some of the slides is also that blacks without incarceration history in their household are almost as comparable as white with incarceration history in their households. So that's something that is coming. We did the analysis separated, so we have never even talked about the results, and it's something that is a common factor between the previous presentation and this presentation. I'm going to go over the beginning, which is the pink elephant in the room. We're going to have limitations with the sample size, and there's sampling methods in terms of these are populations that I tend to be calling like hidden population, given the stigma of identifying yourself with these characteristics, and given the stigma about credit worthiness, the trust, even revealing this information, and at some point even checking for this information could generate a lot of bias in our sample. In addition to that, there is the part that we are not born with a credit score on our forehead as an immigrant, because we older we realize about what that story is about. Like credit history in the United States is created by creating credit history, and then when you start from zero and at adult age, you realize how complicated it is. And because of that, those complications and the mystification behind credit history in the US, there is the underscore population and the credit invisibles. The credit invisibles are those individuals that have zero credit score. They don't have any credit score overall. And then the underscore population will depend on how it's defined, but it would be those who have not been able to develop credit history. And then there's going to be also a problem with the bias response rate due to the problems that I said about credit worthiness and self-report. This is no self-report, but in terms of self-belief of the credit level and how the capacity of whether people want to test themselves, or like when you thinking that you score badly, you don't want to see your FICO score. And I know for life, my first time looking at a credit score was when I was a graduate student and I didn't know what it was about, and I felt like I was failing an exam. No, it wasn't bad. Well, it was, no. Well, I don't know. No, it was bad. I mean, I just have a blue card from American Express, and I had to pay it every time, and they told me this is good, and I did that. That's the only credit history I had. And my credit at that time, 1 year into the US, was bad credit. And I was a graduate student my 1 year in the US. So that's not related to this, but it's in terms of how mystic and how hard it is for any population to understand what is behind creating a good credit history. And the importance of that is how widely used that a score is in several things in our life, from renting an apartment, from applying to a job, from any access to many different resources in the country, and then some measure that is mystic, magical. We don't know exactly how it is and how it's being affected by your behavior. So that's part of some work that I've been doing, also the Bureau of Credit, Consumer Credit, trying to demystify what is the credit history and the formation of credit history. But as I said, the goal is to do this relationship between two measures that are, well, if we think about wealth too, will be another mystic measure, given that it's so difficult to measure. But credit score, generally, it has a lot of issue with measurement error if self-reported. An average American know what the credit score is on the spot. So this has to be more of an observable measure, and the participants were asked to actually check the actual credit score and send evidence of the credit score. That's what's important. But then also incarceration history, which is a stigma, likely for people to hide that kind of information from in survey responses. So these are two important topics, but also very hard to find data consistently and systematically is trying to deliver some measures that understand or help us understand history of access to resources, whether those access to resources result in, or lack of access to resources result on lack of resources in terms of wealth accumulation and in terms of family growth and social mobility, and et cetera. So I said that the main results, if assets are present, tangible assets are mainly cars among the incarceration population. FICO scores tend to be segmented by groups. So tall groups will be white individuals without incarceration history, and again, incarceration history is the household. Someone in the household have been incarcerated. So I'm going to use exposures like the previous group, so we have some consistent language here. And the bottom group will be black with incarceration exposure in terms of FICO scores. So these are the observable measures. And the interesting thing is that this segmentation was also seen in the previous presentation in terms of wealth accumulation. And maybe that is surprising, but remember the wealth accumulation numbers are coming from self-reported data, while the FICO score is coming from the actual measure of FICO scores presented to this individual who responded to this survey. So for the data, this is the second phase of the Baltimore study. And by second phase of the Baltimore study is that participants were contacted back, and then they were the sampling is a little bit different because the Baltimore study is supposed to individually represent each one of the subcategories in Baltimore. But then in this study now we really don't have much information between the FICO scores, between the incarceration history, so we have response rate at each subgroup. So in terms of this study, we have the never incarcerated history household white, which is going to be white with incarceration exposure, black with incarceration exposure would be the second group, white with incarceration exposure, black without incarceration exposure, white with incarceration exposure, and black with incarceration exposure. So it's the same division as the previous group. Because there is and I'm going to repeat this because it's going to be very important. Remember, this is you visiting, kind of visiting back the people that you interview in the first round. Now you're going to ask even, well, not even, but we're going to ask some questions that are as personal, private as a question of incarceration and wealth. There is important literature talking about the level of trust in revealing direct financial information to random requests. Even that this was the second round, there is an idea of whether the credit worthiness is going to affect how much you're willing to reveal also that kind of information. And then there's also the racial disparity in credit visibility and underscore reports. So not only, even if I'm willing to provide this information, I may not be scored. So I may be part of the underscored or invisible population, credit invisible population. So there is a chance that then the response bias is being affected by this potential issue. So I'm going to go a little bit on the review of the phase one just for something, the population, how the data was. And I just want to repeat this because we saw numbers that in the previous presentation that we have to see that as representative of the Baltimore city, not national representative. And that may be why maybe you saw some numbers that didn't look like some of the national numbers that you have seen before. And that's part of the survey, and that's part of all the cities surveys. Each one of the cities in this project are representative of the city itself, and that's why you're going to see separation of race, ethnicity different across the cities in the scorecard projects. So what is the financial situation of African American and white households with individuals who have been incarcerated compared to those without an incarceration history? As I said, that's the main question, and we go walking towards that question, but what we have at this point is whether they have been exposed to incarceration through themselves or any member of the family. And repeating this as many times as I can, so at least you can have that in your mind. So we have 250 individuals in the first sample, in the sample that was presented before. For those people were approached and asked 6 questions. Some of the questions were also related to participants' education and where they're educated. There was not much variation on that, and it hasn't been more explored since I've been working on this on a day at a time. But the question directly was, what is the number of your last FICO credit score in the last 12 months? So there is information of what credit score is, because it's been found that more than 40% of the population in the U.S., if you call it, you'd say, you know what Vantage score stands for, people wouldn't know. So that's how mystic credit scores and these measures are. And so there's explanation what this is and how people can find it and provide that information, not as a self-reported information, but the proof of that information to us. So, and even thought it was, this was taken faster than the first survey. So despite all the efforts, but it's good, but not despite, I'm gonna say, given the efforts, we did get a number of respondents, and we're gonna have the limitation of the sample size, but we got 48 respondents in our sample out of the 249. And And the subpopulations are going to be now in the phase one, we're at 254 in total. We have 48 out of those individuals, but out of the 48, 2 respondents didn't have a credit scores, and that's part of the underscore population. And then we do have, now what we have to do is, well, how we saw it was the phase 2 is looking at the phase 1 as the baseline population, because the phase 1, it was trying to represent each one of the subpopulations in the Baltimore City. And we don't have any more way to know the distribution of this population, because again, coming back to the story, these tend to be hidden population, and there's no representative distribution of this population at national or city, much less city level, actually definitely no city level. So we have a larger representation of white incarcerated, and then followed by white non-incarcerated, and followed by black incarcerated, and the last group, black not incarcerated. In Baltimore, I'm not going to act like an expert because we had Aaron who was here just minutes ago, but Baltimore was is ground zero in terms of incarceration history. Specific changes and policies were made during the several years in Baltimore, and this is just a visual of the timeline and incarceration rate in policies. It's not exhaustive of all the policies of all the years, but you can see once you compare that pattern to the black solid line is Baltimore compared to Maryland and compared to national levels. Baltimore has 5, 10, depending on which you compare to, times the rate of incarceration history than other geographic, or definitely that Maryland history. So this makes us, that having this historical high, make it the first phase very relevant topic to study in that city, but also give us to see how something that remarkably can change your life and change the course of your life will be having an incarceration history, and how that may be related or may correlate to any future potential success in terms of financial success. It's going to be very important as we understand us as economists. But in addition to that, we need to think about, we say that people coming back to the normal civil life after incarceration history, we're thinking about the opportunities that these individuals will have in the market. And if there's something that we see in here, we saw this with the results previews that I gave you, the family may have been impacted in some way, and this is reflected in their credit history, in the credit scores. This could become just a downward spiral story in getting always a race to the bottom of the credit score, at least. So around 15% of African American and Hispanic are credit invisible. This is a national level. This is not concentrated in Baltimore. 13 and 12% of blacks and Hispanic have unscored credit records, almost double the proportion compared to whites. So credit invisibility on score credit is going to give us into a problem when we're going to try to bring this measure into our analysis. And this is what is going to happen when you're asking people for this information, even if they don't have it. But at least you get information that they don't have it, of course. Then the most trickier one is creditworthiness misprediction. Blacks are more likely to underreport creditworthiness and lower credit knowledge. So, and this is not about, well, I don't know anything about my financials history, or I don't know anything about opening a bank account. It's not just about that. It's about how well we all think about ourselves overall, and then in general, if it's an information that we're not dealing with on a daily basis, we don't see our credit score like we see the time and the weather daily, then it becomes some kind of mark on your life that you don't want to see it. If you think your credit worthiness is very low, the last thing you want to do is to open and check your credit score, right? So there is a likelihood that individuals who are measuring themselves in a lower level are less likely to provide this kind of information. And then again, the trust that we'll have with random interviewers calling us. So I'm saying all this because to at least do some analysis with the phase 2, I need to think about response rate in a different way, not just as a proportion of the populations, but also giving the specific answers to specific questions that were very relevant in the first phase. Well, the first thing is that also definitely comparing and seeing that in terms of age and family income, there was not much different in family income, mean and median. There was some difference with some of the groups, especially for blacks being slightly younger, the ones who respond to credit history, comparing to the original phase 1 Baltimore. So the sample that I have for the phase 2 Baltimore, the credit score sample, is slightly younger among the incarcerated black groups. And that's what but in terms of other things, it seems that it was not much different. But there was something that I do, and it's kind of a propensity score analysis in terms of saying what is the likelihood of you responding to the survey. And I include in this analysis characteristics that are obvious, like education, or whether they have some kind of traditional use of traditional institution for the financial transactions, if they have a checking account or saving accounts, if they own anything. But in addition to that, I add 2 questions that were asked in the phase 1, and it's part of, there's some proxy for trust and creditworthiness. One is how the interviewer felt that the interviewee was in terms of answering questions related to the financial situation in financial information. So that's kind of the trust, even though it was still very subjective, it's still giving us some idea of something, how hard it was for the person who was being interviewed of giving this information. And the other one was a self-report about financial status. Remember, but in the first phase, individuals were asked in some way for some self-reported score, not the number of FICO score, but a self-reported financial status. So, but this individual didn't necessarily, they were not asked about the credit score. But then in the future, we're gonna ask them about the credit score. So this phase 1 question is how bad they think the financial status is. So, and that's part of the creditworthiness portion that I was saying that could create some bias in the response rate for the phase 2. And we find, I have some stars that shouldn't be, and we find some relevant in terms of that first response. From now on, those are the difference in the averages, but this was the result for the regression, and we find that are definitely less likely to respond as if the interviewer found that they were not open to talk about the financial, and they were also less likely to respond if they feel that they have bad finances. So there's this part of trust and creditworthiness that we need to deal with when we're dealing with this. We deal with this again, with this kind of information on how we build this kind of relationship that create an environment in which this information can be revealed, or not just revealed. Again, I'm talking about even the individual wanted to know what their credit score is going into that active part. So in terms of creditworthiness, in terms of credit scores, we found that about all no incarceration or no incarceration exposure white are having the higher credit score, and then followed by, and so maybe that by black without incarceration history, and then white and blacks following in the back. Like this is on average. But when we start thinking about whether they have liquid assets, so I start separating. So yeah, this is on average, but what happened? What is your credit score if you actually have liquid assets? What is your credit score if you actually have some tangible assets? What is it, like now that you know you have accumulated these assets, what your credit score is? I mean, this is a reverse. This is reverse, of course, like your credit history is going to be affected by your accumulation of wealth, but your accumulation of wealth is going to be affected by your credit history. So, but we will expect that people that are likely to have have higher accumulation of wealth are likely to have higher FICO score, right? That will be in our mind. So if you have tangible assets, if you have liquid assets, you should be more likely to have higher credit scores, because that's what the story should be, right? The credit score should also tell us about the credit history of the individual. So we find that there is such a story here, but one of the interesting things is that Black without incarceration, in terms of liquid assets, is giving us information that is relevant for incarceration, those individuals with incarceration history, but it doesn't tell us much about the difference between Black and whites without incarceration history. In terms of other assets, again, it tells us the having any other assets. It tells us about the people with incarceration history compared to white without incarceration history or exposure, but it doesn't give us much in terms of Black without incarceration history. And one thing that started happening is that Black without incarceration history FICO scores start to look very similar to a white with incarceration history with any type of assets. So the FICO score becomes less indicative of something there than just accumulation of assets. And it's very interesting because incarceration history or exposure on its own, it's a negative predictor on wealth and a negative predictor on credit scores. But it doesn't affect that much white as it affects Blacks. In terms of tangible assets, we don't find much difference in terms of home ownership and car ownership among the subgroups that responded to the phase 2, but we do find a lot of difference in the lower rate among Black with non-incarceration history. All these numbers are comparing every one of incarcerated group, Black with no incarceration history, with white without incarceration history. So a reference point is white without incarceration history. And as we go into each group, a very interesting piece is that when we look at car ownership, the potential of having a car is also among, it gives us a lower FICO score among those with incarceration history. There is a likelihood, like a big, in terms of assets, people with incarceration history are more likely to have a tangible asset, a car, compared to a house with all other groups. Then I look at unsecured debts, and we're gonna see patterns similar. The most important, well, not the most, each one is important, but credit card debt becomes more dynamic, and mostly because it's likely that as the individuals who are responding to this have a credit history. And this is kind of what is first, the chicken or the egg. So if you can have a credit card debt only if you have a credit history, or you have a credit card, so you're gonna have a credit history. So the scores are not gonna be part of the sample by definition. So there's, and this come with any type of debts that I'm gonna follow here, because you can probably accumulate assets in some form, but you cannot create debt in the US at least, or at least the formal questions that we ask. Maybe debt to family members will have been an interesting one to say here. But debt to a formal institution, you have to have a credit history and you have to have a credit score. The mortgages, we see that people that have a mortgage, there's not much difference, or house, because again, the selection of having a mortgage is that you're gonna buy a house, you being approved for a house, and then the credit process there is already selecting the sample of those who are gonna be lucky enough or privileged enough to have a mortgage. Different to auto loan, which are many more different forms of owning a car, and many different formal and informal ways most likely to own a car. And that's what we see more of a relevance in terms of having an auto loan. We see the difference across group, but very interesting again, the Blacks without incarceration exposures are not much different than Black with incarceration exposure. Than white with incarceration exposure. And we do that with the people that think that asset values are bad, they have bad finance, that they self-report bad finance. We have people that report that African American or Black with incarceration exposure who report having bad finance, but then on average the FICO score is 711. Yeah, so we found some evidence of what the literature have done a little bit more systematically than this, but people being wrong about their own financial status, even like under diminishing the credit worthiness. That would be the way to present it. So I do this with liquid assets again and total assets, and I'm just gonna try to give you how it's hard to see the points here, but most of the time what you will see in these points is that the population distributed, and you can just segment this part is where incarceration exposure, Black with incarceration exposure will be accumulated. This part is where white without incarceration history will be accumulated. White with incarceration exposure will be across the board, and Black with incarceration without incarceration exposure will be all some way around the middle, even when I condition on total asset values. Having assets are, we see similar thing with car value, but a little bit more dispersed. And all the point is that whether the way to prove all this is whether to see if the FICO score was really giving some information that was valid, given that you already know if people have assets or no. And we see that in some portion it is functioning for some part of the population. It seems that it's functioning for white individuals with and without incarceration history. But for Black individuals without incarceration history or exposure, we see in them that they're undervaluing FICO score and they're underestimating the value, the credit worthiness, yeah. They see that we get no house and debt values too, and the FICO score and the comparison across groups. The groups, we see consistently again that Black without incarceration history, it seems they go all across the board, but not towards the top of the distribution in FICO score, very concentrated in the middle, regardless, even though they don't have any history of incarceration. And this, again, similar. So in all this analysis, and I think for me, one of the, well, there were several findings, but definitely, and I'm going to repeat it because I haven't done it enough, is how race is an important piece of this information. Incarceration history matters more for white population in terms of FICO scores, but for African American, for Blacks without incarceration history, we're looking very similar with white with incarceration history, especially when you start detailing assets and debts. And that tells us something about what's happened. Well, not tell us, that should tell us that we should ask what's happening of that evolution of credit scores and how those credit scores are evaluated, or how they are impacting a population that, at least in the mainstream economics, we should expect remarkable differences across these groups. But keep in mind, first, this is local to Baltimore, applied to Baltimore population within each one of the subsample. It's a sample size that is small, so that's important. And there's a gender underrepresentation of non-female incarcerated Black and large female representation in incarcerated for women, for white women. So there is some difference there, and this is the first research that is looking at this very hard to find population or hidden population, and try to put together two elements that for us researchers have been individually very hard to evaluate: incarceration history, the incarcerated population, and the wealth accumulation, and then the measure that is widely used, a FICO score or credit scores, and whether the they are as objectives as we think they are, and how widely they use and how they can be perversive in an indirect way or direct way. I'm not going to take the direct way away, but this research is giving us some evidence that we have to look further into how credit score have been built, and especially about what are the potential mechanisms within the evaluation of credit scores that is impacting populations that, if this is an observable measure or objective measure, it should represent the value and credit value of that the population that they are identifying. Again, going back to Black family or Black individuals with having at least one household member with a history of incarceration. So thank you so much. Any question, I'm open. This work is in progress because we are in the pandemic. So I'm open to questions, ideas, or how to further look at different perspectives into this research. Any of your research that is connected to this, bring it on. We'll put it in a reference. But it has been a pleasure to be here. This is my first presentation since pandemic, and I was panicking, but now I feel at home. Thank you so much. Well, I feel at home before questions, so now you question. Any question? Yeah. Elinda? Uh-huh.
Yeah. This is for my own kind of knowledge, but why is the reference group the white, non-incarcerated? Like, my mind, I would have made it be Black, but so I just need an understanding why, because then you could have seen, I don't know, if I'm concerned about, I guess because I'm concerned about the African Americans, and I'm from Baltimore. Why the white as the kind of the top? And you started off, saying that you were making it that way. Just help me understand.
Well, the first one is, on average, that group, like on the unconditional average statistics, they were with the highest credit scores. And then also, as a subpopulation, when we were separating by having assets and the level of assets, the credit score seems to follow the expected patterns, like lower assets, lower credit score, high assets, higher credit score. So then that's a sustainable and more comparison group that it's following the theory about what the FICO scores are for. So then you can, if you have that as a baseline, then you can then compare the other groups that you had your suspicion that maybe something is happening with the other groups. So that's why I have the white non-incarceration exposure group as a baseline. So yeah, the FICO score is working for them. That's what I can say, yeah. And you had a question? Yeah.
Maybe I missed in the beginning when you showed. So you used some kind of a survey monkey. How did you get the data from them? Like when you...
for the phase 2?
Yes.
So we call, we email, we mail the individuals from the phase 1, so the Baltimore study and the phase 1. And then, well, it started really with email and mail, like a formal mail, and inviting those who have participated in the phase 1. When they didn't respond, we will contact them by phone up to 3 times. And then in those 3 contacts or 3 different ways of contact, we will provide information on how they can check the credit score. To increase the response rate, we give monetary incentive for people to respond to the survey. So that was the 3 ways. Yeah.
Okay, so there was like Amazon cards, I don't know, some gift cards or something.
There were. I don't remember if it were Amazon cards,
Okay,
but
okay.
no, it was 25, and it was increased at the last at $50
Okay.
to increase response rate. Yeah.
So for both phase 1 and phase 2, what was the total duration? How long did it take for you to get the data?
So 2017 is phase 1. Beginning of 2019 is phase 2.
Okay, thank you.
Francisca is going to ask. Let me get some water.
I have a few questions. Okay, yeah, since he was asking about sampling, actually, I know, you're coming from the phase one, and this was actually my question for the other paper too. What is the sampling frame? Especially, since we're going to focus on this incarceration difference. And you talked about that a little bit more and how, they had to have some relationship to an incarcerated person. But, so that's how I took to be your definition of incarcerated. Mm-hmm. But what about the non-incarcerated population? Where are they coming from?
So they are the ones who didn't have any family member who had an incarceration.
Okay.
Yes.
How did you, what's the sampling frame that they're drawn from?
Okay. So for that's more a response for the Baltimore study, because in the Baltimore study, what they do is use census and the proportion of incarcerated population at the individual level, and the sampling is within subsample. So it's more in the phase one that we have, that your question will fit into, because there's
The phase one is supposed to be representative of broader Baltimore.
Yes.
I see.
Oh,
Okay.
and yes, exactly.
Yes, okay,
And my
okay.
sample to reflect that.
I
Yeah.
see. I see. Okay, great. And then you were talking about the FICO score, but I feel like I think you said it started at 0, and I honestly don't remember what my FICO score was. I was like my first credit card, but it just doesn't seem like it can start from 0, right? Because then if you perform badly on your credit, it needs to go down. So what is the starting point for the score?
You see, I don't know. Like 250, 300, 350. Because if you find actually the ones that have reported, it was 0. When I said 0 was it was telling my story, but really when you are here, you are on score or credit
Right,
invisible.
so certainly I know there's
So
gonna
you
be
go
no
from
score.
credit invisible, like
Right,
missing
yeah,
point, to
missing.
350.
To 350. Okay, that's helpful. Okay, so then if you're lower than 350, then it means you've basically had a negative credit report. Basically, obviously you can have.
You don't get
other
it.
negatives,
That's what
but-
it's always a positive measure.
Right, yeah,
Or
that's what
it's
I'm
no
saying.
measure. So it's either you start from the lowest possible, that is not 0, or you don't exist in the credit
Okay.
world.
Yeah.
In the
Well, I
financial
think
world.
maybe some framing about the FICO
That's
score
good,
would
yes.
be helpful. Also, because, obviously the FICO score is going to make a huge difference in terms of actual costs when you go to, get any kind of loan, right? So maybe some context about that, this difference is going to mean the difference in a monthly payment of so much on a, average house value in Baltimore or something. It's like a real cost that they're going to have to pay, for 30 years or something like that, based on this.
Oh, I love
Yeah,
that.
and
Yeah.
those are my questions.
Oh, I love
Thank you.
that. I
Good
know.
work.
Thank
Yeah.
you, Francisca. Yeah, I know what you mean. Like, what is the 250 points or 100 points? What does it mean that how many years it matters in terms of credit building their credit so that they recover those 100 points? Yeah. Thank you.
So maybe this is a cynical perspective, right? But the problem with the logic of this is the credit score gap, if the credit score gap did not exist, black people would be better off in this way, right? If the purpose of the credit score is to maintain intergroup disparity, right? If the credit score itself is just one way in which that's maintained, you're not really, you're pointing at a symptom, but closing that may not be a reliable way to improve relative position.
Well, well, and I think the point is more like
I can put it one more way.
Yeah,
it's kind of
sure.
like whack-a-mole. Is this just a credit score popped up? Okay, we'll fix the credit score, but something else is going to pop up. So, and that's only a problem when you talk about when you put the credit score gap in context of, okay, if we were going to fix this, it would have a causal relationship in terms of people's borrowing costs or something else. You know,
But,
I mean, we could acknowledge the bias in credit scores, but also acknowledge that there's going to be discrimination that may come up in other forms.
yeah, but it's also, yeah. Yes, Andy? It's how objective people think that the FICO score are, that you find in this is already like, okay,
I just wanted to comment on
yes.
that. You know, this is not a situation in which the argument's being made that improving FICO scores is going to solve all problems.
Oh, yeah, no, is that,
Now, if you were to solve all problems, let's talk about reparations for Black Americans.
well, I'm not surprised. Yeah, Bill, exactly.
Well, I thought his point was this. The point of the ARDS article was that because blacks don't appreciate what their credit score is, they are susceptible to discrimination. So her article is within the context of the subprime loan crisis, in which we saw black people who had credit scores that should have gotten them a prime loan willingly accepting subprime loans.
Two prime loans, yeah.
And so that's a real thing. So one interesting thing would be looking at the credit scores you have, do blacks look like they are getting access to equal credit? You can't tell that totally because, as was pointed out, right, you're not looking at terms of loans. So I think that gets more to the whack-a-mole question. If we could remove bias in the credit scores, that would be one thing. But even if we removed it, do we still see the evidence that the subprime loan crisis clearly documented that blacks with the same credit scores as whites don't get the same terms? The other interesting thing is, I think you put to bed forever this notion that black people spend a lot on cars. I mean, I hope you put that at the top of the report. Like, you know, there's a wealth gap.
Yeah, the auto loan and car ownership.
Baltimore is not a wash, and Mercedes-Benz.
But I'm not going to say that, Bill. But yeah. Unless you are the referee of the journal.
On the issue of incarceration, there are different types of incarceration, and of course, you're not controlling for them. If you're in a federal prison, your family has that type of experience. It's very different than if you're in the Baltimore jail.
Thank you for that, yes.
And since we're talking about Baltimore, and this is probably not fair because we don't have good panel data on it, but I'd be very curious to know if you know when the incarceration happened, to what effect did the ban the box legislation that went through in Baltimore in 2014, I believe it was, may have changed those effects, because at one point it might have been harder to find a job than otherwise. I know that that's still an open question that's out there, but this could be one of those side effects that's there.
Thank you. I don't recall if we had the question on the timing, but no, I think that the question is more whether it happened to the head of the household, and we can go to that level. That is a little bit more individual, but yeah, we don't have the timing.
Where there could have been in the sample size those who had been affected by this corrective legislation, but we still come to these results. I think we're still in the same situation, aren't we? I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Because some could have been able to build a better credit score.
Use the microphone, please.
So the argument is that if you benefited from ban of the box, then you could have gotten employment, thus improve your credit score. But if you were incarcerated beforehand, then you could still have been discriminated against when it came to applications for jobs, thus, again, making it hard to pay your bills and so on, which would decrease your credit score.
Right.
So I was curious, right, because the reason the ban the box question is open is that there's research on both sides saying it helps some people, it also may have discriminated against some people. So even the labor market outcome is, is at question. And this would be another way to get at that. Did credit scores improve or not?
But I should have started this presentation asking everyone to write down on a piece of paper what the credit score was. That's what I will do next time. No, seriously. And like now it's much accessible, especially for the type of population that is in this room. And that's something to say about this measure that is widely used. Many of us do not know really how it works. So, but then it has the power to say yes or no to an individual future credit and life and wealth accumulation. So I think as the first step, criticizing the measure and noticing this kind of patterns, it's going to be like unveiling something in a way that it hasn't been unveiled before. It might be criticized in different ways, but it's showing that it's not as objective as we wish. And it worked for some people. And we know the people at work, like, and maybe, but, and as a side note, again, my history with credit scores, it's something like I taught my husband, who is white American, about credit history, credit scores, the first time we had to buy a house, and my credit score was higher than his. Thank you so much. Oh, other question? Okay.
This is also about Baltimore incarceration. But there was a slide that showed rates of Baltimore incarceration compared with other, maybe it was Rafi, I can't remember who presented it, maybe it was Lauren, I can't remember. But anyway, was that based on place of birth, Baltimore incarcerations compared with the rest of the population?
No,
It's not.
Theirs was African American, like was race only, no race and place of birth.
So it's just, so if I understand correctly, then the rates of incarceration are much higher in Baltimore based on current residence. I imagine it would map
Yes.
to place of birth, but those numbers that we saw were based on current residence.
Yes.
Are there a lot of prisons nearby Baltimore? I also don't know Baltimore very well. Where are the prisons anywhere, nearby? Are there? Linda is my Baltimore.
Linda or Aaron? But use the mic, Aaron. Yeah.
I defer to the residents of Baltimore.
I mean, they're in Maryland, but not necessarily in the city.
It's by resident, but it's by, like in, like some of the statistics, especially the Vera Institute, they look at, when they ask the person in the prison in Maryland where the residence is, then one of every 3 person in prison in Maryland is from Baltimore. So then it's for place of residence. Not where the prison is located physically within the state, but the resident of the individuals who are in prison. Now there may be a bias in terms of what they report as resident. That's true.
The geographic question, though, is extremely interesting in terms of, like, based off Ruthie Gilmore's argument that surplus land. Can you hear me okay?
It's for the recording, Aaron. Yeah. No, it doesn't have a cord. Look, all this time we could have done that. Great.
Yeah, no, I mean, so the geographical question about where exactly facilities of incarceration are located, I mean, that's really interesting in that it would help us correspond Maryland's case with what Ruthie Gilmore observed in California, because what Ruthie Gilmore's argument in Golden Gulag was that the prison system helps to resolve a crisis in surplus land, and so The geographical problem is extremely important, because if you're talking about surplus land, well, where is the land? I always go back to her study. It's like a combination geography, sociology, to see how she's trying to frame the broader carceral economy that helped build California's, like, contemporary stage of development. Like, why is the prison system in California so enormous, right? And where Maryland helps us is, compared to California, it's a different GDP and everything. And so whether Gilmore's thesis holds in a different context, I mean, that's actually really challenging. So the geography is really interesting, but I think for us, we were just concerned about, whether in this city, respondents within the city have exposure to incarceration in their family, and if that maps onto the wealth gap in some manner. I think that's where we differ, I think, from the geographic thesis that Gilmore proposed.
Yeah, and there was some interest. I think the response rate was not high enough to do something interesting, but it was about where people went to school within, not just in the state, but within the state, to kind of look at probably where your question is coming from the geographic distribution of prisons and people coming from areas that were nearby, like a poor neighborhood, but also areas that are closer to prisons or jails or precincts, but there's not much room, but there probably will be in the future if we replicate this study and amplify it and help some of the issues we have with the response rate at this for this phase 2. But yeah, it's going to be, it was in mind the geographic location connected to the past history on educational, where they went to school at high school, yeah. Thank you. More questions? Yeah, there's one.
Monica,
Sandra, yeah.
As someone said, the type of reason why you went to prison matters. So that determines the how long were you there. So just to keep in mind, I don't know if you captured that or not, but of course, the longer you are out of real life, the more the effect gets accentuated. Something to think about. And then the takeaway, as Linda said, how we affect humanity. We do these studies to reach public policy recommendations. I always tell the students, we conclude, what for? So if you had to give one policy recommendation to policymakers in Baltimore, what would you tell them? I mean, just to, yeah, I mean, you can think about it. You don't have to tell me. You have to tell them. Hopefully, when you publish these, you do that, because in the end, it's about changing people's lives. And then, of course, as Sandy said, we can always change the credit score, make it all look good. And how can we really use this great research that you've done? But by the way, I applaud it because it's very important. But in the end, what can we do about this?
Well, one is, and as I said, unveil this mystified measure of, accounted as an objective measure of creditworthiness. I think, and I think we are not the only ones saying that. Already has some process going on this matter, but to understand that that it has some biases already implanted in a measure that nobody knows how it's being constructed. So whether it's to improve that or no, that's not really what I will say my conclusion is. And whether build or fewer prisons or create better relationship with the community is not even that part of, and the level of incarceration and poverty and stories of police brutality, but it's really to bring to put the light on something that it has been put in an altar of financial success. And that's, I think, is to show that it's not that shiny. Oh no, we have more questions. Anthony, right? Charles. Who is Anthony Baker? Oh no, for St. Olaf. Okay, Baker.
This is actually not a question. This is just a response to say what can we do? Chris Timmons and I have an honors student who's using data from Self-Help Credit Union, which is aimed at working with families with low FICO scores and offering, and working through with a credit management, loan management system. Question is, does it, coming up with controls, does this actually have an impact? So, the answer to this is once you identify FICO as being systematically underappreciated for certain groups, can you identify ways of alternative credit ratings that lead to comparable repayment and delinquency rates?
Thank you. So, without more to say, we can talk later if you, if you want. Thank you so much. Thank you for staying here. Bye.